Hi there. Let your mind slow down and relax your body. We aim to be calm and peaceful. And please, in the comments, write down your best help for sleeping and let me know where you are from. And never forget that you are loved and important in this world to somebody. You are unique and we love you. The face at the window. My grandmother's house was old, the kind of place where every floorboard creaked and the windows rattled in the wind. It sat on the edge of a dense forest, the tall trees casting long shadows across the yard, even in the middle of the day. I used to love visiting her, despite the eerie isolation of the house. But one summer, something happened that I've never been able to forget. I was staying in the upstairs guest room, which overlooked the backyard. The room was small, with faded wallpaper and a bed that creaked whenever you moved. The window had no curtains, just thin blinds that did little to block out the moonlight. At night, the forest looked like an endless sea of darkness, its edges blending into the shadows of the yard. It started on my second night there. I woke up around 3 a.m., my mouth dry and my heart pounding for no reason. As I reached for the glass of water on the nightstand, I saw it, a face at the window. It was pale and expressionless, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through the glass. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The face didn't move, didn't blink. It just stared. I wanted to scream, but my voice was stuck in my throat. I scrambled out of bed, backing toward the door, my eyes locked on the face, and then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been a dream. But the following night, it happened again. This time, I woke to a faint tapping sound, like fingernails against glass. The face was there again, closer now, its features clearer in the moonlight. Its lips were slightly parted, as though it were trying to speak. I bolted for my grandmother's room, waking her with frantic whispers about someone outside. She grabbed a flashlight and followed me back to the guest room, but by the time we got there, the face was gone. The window was closed, the yard below empty. "You're just imagining things," she said gently, though her eyes betrayed her concern. "This house can play tricks on you at night." But I knew it wasn't my imagination. For the rest of my stay, I avoided looking out the window. But on my last night, curiosity got the better of me. I opened the blinds just a crack, peeking out into the moonlit yard. The face was there, staring back at me from the edge of the forest. I haven't been back to my grandmother's house in years, but sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I feel like I'm being watched. And when I look toward the window, I half expect to see it there, waiting. The room with no air. When I moved into my new apartment, I thought it was perfect. It was small, but it was all mine. The building was old, sure, with narrow hallways and the occasional groan of pipes, but it had character. The landlord gave me the usual spiel about the rules, including one that stood out: don't use the storage room on the 4th floor. "Why not?" I asked, more out of curiosity than concern. "It's locked," he replied curtly. "Old stuff from previous tenants. Nothing you need to worry about." I didn't think much of it. Why would I? It was just a storage room. But over time, I started noticing strange things. The 4th floor was empty. No tenants, no furniture, just a dusty corridor with a single locked door at the end. Whenever I passed by, I felt an odd pressure in the air, like the weight of the atmosphere changed near that door. One night, as I was coming back from a late shift, I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping, coming from the storage room. It was so soft I almost didn't notice it, but once I did, it was impossible to ignore. I stopped, my heart pounding, and stared at the door. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, like someone drumming their fingers on the other side. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the empty hallway. The tapping stopped. I stood there for a moment, my breath shallow, before shaking it off and heading to my apartment. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. Who, or what, was behind that door? The tapping started again the next night. This time, it was louder, closer. I pressed my ear to the door, my skin prickling as I listened. It wasn't just tapping, it was breathing. Slow, labored breaths, as though something inside was struggling to fill its lungs. I stepped back, my stomach churning with unease. The air felt heavier now, the pressure almost unbearable. I hurried back to my apartment, locking the door behind me. The next day, I confronted the landlord. "What's in that storage room?" I demanded. He sighed, rubbing his temples. "There's nothing in there," he said, but his tone lacked conviction. "Just forget about it." I didn't forget. That night, armed with a screwdriver and a flashlight, I made my way back to the 4th floor. The hallway was silent, the air thick with tension. The tapping had stopped, replaced by an eerie stillness that made my skin crawl. It took me nearly 10 minutes to force the lock open. The door creaked as it swung inward, revealing a small, empty room. The walls were bare, the floor covered in a thin layer of dust. But the air, it was suffocating, thick and heavy, like I was trying to breathe underwater. I stepped inside, shining my flashlight around. That's when I saw it. A chair sat in the center of the room, and on it was a single crumpled piece of paper. I picked it up, my hands trembling, and unfolded it. The words scrawled across the page sent a chill down my spine. "Don't open the door. It lets it out." I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me. The flashlight flickered, and the air grew even heavier. I couldn't breathe. Something moved in the corner of the room, a shadow darker than the rest, shifting and growing. I don't remember how I got out. The next thing I knew, I was in the hallway, gasping for air, the door firmly locked behind me. I moved out the next day, leaving most of my belongings behind. Whatever was in that room, it wasn't meant to be disturbed. And now, I fear it's no longer confined. The Whispering Grave. The cemetery sat on a hill at the edge of town, its wrought iron gates rusted and overgrown with ivy. No one went there unless they had to. Not because it was dangerous, but because it felt wrong. The air was always colder there, the wind quieter, the silence oppressive. I had always avoided the place, but one night, on a dare, I found myself standing at its gates. My friends laughed as they shoved me forward. "Go touch the old headstone," one of them said, grinning, "the one with the angel." I rolled my eyes, pretending not to care. "Fine," I said, stepping into the cemetery. The gravel path crunched beneath my feet as I walked past rows of weathered tombstones. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying a faint, mournful sound. The angel statue was easy to find. It stood tall and imposing, its wings outstretched, its stone face tilted toward the sky. The name on the grave had been worn away by time, leaving only a faint inscription at the base. "Listen, and you will hear." I hesitated, the hair on the back of my neck prickling. The wind stilled, and the air grew colder. For a moment, the world felt frozen. Then I heard it. A faint whisper coming from the ground beneath the statue. It was soft at first, like the rustle of leaves, but it grew louder as I leaned closer. It wasn't just a whisper. It was a voice that sounded desperate, pleading. "Help me!" I stumbled back, my heart racing. The voice continued, growing louder, more frantic. "Please, help me." I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing in the silence. My friends were waiting at the gates, their laughter fading as they saw my pale face. "What happened?" one of them asked. I didn't answer. I couldn't. That night, I couldn't sleep. The whispering followed me home, filling my room with its desperate pleas. It spoke my name over and over, until I thought I would lose my mind. I've never been back to the cemetery, but sometimes, late at night, I hear the whisper again, faint and distant, as though it's still calling to me from beneath the earth. The man in the woods. I grew up in a small town surrounded by miles of dense forest. Everyone in town had stories about the woods, tales of strange lights, eerie noises, and people who went in but never came out. My parents warned me to stay away, but the woods were too tempting. They felt alive, almost magical, and as a kid I couldn't resist exploring them. One summer, my best friend Liam and I decided to camp out in the woods. We were 16 and thought we were invincible, laughing off the warnings from our parents and the legends whispered around town. Armed with flashlights, sleeping bags, and enough snacks to last us the night, we set off in the late afternoon, following a narrow trail that led deeper into the forest. We found a small clearing just before sunset and set up camp. The air was cool and quiet, the only sounds the rustling leaves and the distant calls of birds. We built a fire, roasting marshmallows and sharing ghost stories until the sun dipped below the horizon and the forest grew dark. It was around midnight when we heard the first sound. A low, guttural noise, like the growl of an animal, echoed through the trees. Liam and I froze, our laughter dying instantly. "Probably just a coyote," he said, though his voice wavered. I nodded, trying to ignore the knot forming in my stomach. But then we heard it again, closer this time, and more deliberate. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. "Let's check it out," Liam whispered, grabbing his flashlight. "Are you insane?" I hissed. "We should stay by the fire." But he was already standing, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Reluctantly, I followed, clutching my own flashlight like a lifeline. We moved cautiously through the trees, the forest eerily silent except for the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. The growling had stopped, replaced by a strange, shuffling sound, like something dragging across the ground. My heart pounded in my chest as we approached the source of the noise. And then we saw him. A man stood in the shadows, his back to us. He was tall and thin, his clothes tattered and stained with what looked like dirt, or maybe blood. His arms hung limply at his sides, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge us, but the air around him felt wrong, heavy, like it was pressing down on us. "Sir?" Liam called out, his voice trembling. "Are you okay?" The man's head snapped around, too fast to be human. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow and black. A chilling smile stretched across his face, far too wide, as if his skin were being pulled taut. He took a step toward us. "Run!" I screamed, grabbing Liam's arm and pulling him back toward the campsite. We sprinted through the trees, our flashlights bouncing wildly, the shadows around us twisting and shifting. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear him. His footsteps, impossibly fast and heavy, closing the distance between us. When we reached the clearing, the fire was out, the campsite eerily still. Without stopping, we grabbed our things and bolted back to the trail, the man's footsteps echoing behind us. We didn't stop running until we were back in town, gasping for air as we stumbled onto the main road. The man was gone, but the feeling of his presence lingered, a cold weight pressing against my chest. I haven't set foot in those woods since that night. Liam moved away the following year, and we never spoke about what happened again. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I think I see him, standing at the edge of the trees, his hollow eyes watching, waiting. The woman behind the mirror. The evening was uneventful, just like any other day during our work trip. My coworker Rebecca and I had returned to our hotel after a grueling day in the field. The stale smell of hotel air greeted us as we stepped into the hallway, each of us holding on to the mundane comfort of our room keys. I was exhausted, longing for a hot shower and a bed that smelled faintly of bleach. As we reached our rooms, Rebecca lingered outside hers, chatting with me while I fiddled with my door. The card reader flashed green, and I pushed the door open. A sense of unease washed over me immediately. The bathroom light was on. I hadn't left it that way. The sound of running water wasn't present, nor the faint hum of any typical hotel sounds, but there was movement. The shadow of a figure danced faintly through the frosted glass of the bathroom door. "Hello?" My voice echoed in the empty room. There was no response. A logical explanation surfaced. It must be the cleaning staff finishing up. But then I saw her. A woman emerged, her frame small but her presence jarring. Her hair was wild, her clothes disheveled. In her hands she clutched a bundle of clothing. My clothing. "Excuse me," I yelled, my voice shaky. "What are you doing?" The woman froze, her eyes wide with a mix of guilt and desperation. Rebecca peered into the room, alarm flashing across her face. The intruder began mumbling, her words barely coherent. My key. It still works," she stammered, holding up the key card as if it explained her presence. "It still works. That's how I got in." Her words rattled me. My mind raced to make sense of the situation. The hotel had assured us the rooms were secure, yet here she was, not just trespassing, but mid-robbery. "Put that down," I shouted, pointing to my clothes in her arms. She hesitated, her trembling fingers loosening their grip on the bundle before letting it fall to the floor. Behind me, Rebecca was motionless, her face pale. The woman clutched a white plastic bag and began edging toward the door. "It's my stuff," she insisted, her voice trembling. "Just my things. I'll show you." She opened the bag briefly, revealing its contents, miscellaneous junk that didn't seem to belong to me. For a moment, I felt relief. Maybe she hadn't stolen anything vital. My mistake was letting her leave. The door slammed shut behind her, and a cold silence filled the room. I began surveying the damage. The drawers were open, my clothes tossed about carelessly. My bags were rifled through, and personal items were scattered on the bed. In the bathroom, it was worse. My neatly folded underwear and bikinis were crammed into one of my bags. Even my passport had been unceremoniously shoved in alongside them. A sick feeling settled in my stomach. "Rebecca," I called out, my voice cracking. "She went through my medication." I ran to the hallway, my shoes slapping against the worn carpet as I darted toward the lobby. The woman was gone. I searched frantically in the laundry room, even stepping outside to check the perimeters of the building, but there was no sign of her. Defeated, I returned to my room, where Rebecca waited with a worried expression. The police arrived quickly, questioning us as I tried to recall every detail. One officer began inspecting the room, his flashlight sweeping over the disarray. That's when I noticed it. Small bits of drywall in the sink. "Hey, what's this from?" I asked, pointing it out to the officer. He frowned and looked around. We checked the door frame, the windows, anywhere she might have pried her way in, but nothing was amiss. "She must have had a spare key," the officer concluded, though his tone betrayed his uncertainty. Hours later, after the officers had left, I sat on the edge of the bed, replaying everything in my mind. My eyes kept drifting back to the sink. Something about that drywall didn't sit right with me. I stood and approached the bathroom, staring at the mirror above the sink. Slowly, the pieces clicked into place. "Rebecca!" I shouted, adrenaline surging. She rushed in, alarmed. "Help me pull this mirror off the wall," I said. Together we lifted it, exposing what lay behind. My stomach turned. There was a hollow cavity behind the mirror, a space large enough for someone to crawl through. My flashlight revealed a grotesque sight. A pillow, a blanket, cigarette butts, empty cans, and discarded clothing. This woman hadn't just broken into my room. She had been living in the walls. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat as the realization hit me. She had been there the whole time. Every moment I had been in this room, every night I had fallen asleep, she could have been just on the other side of the mirror, watching, waiting. The hotel staff were baffled. They admitted the walls had been under renovation, but hadn't been properly sealed. The woman likely accessed the space through the unfinished section, and had been living there for days, if not weeks. Cigarette smoke I had previously dismissed as coming through the vents was hers. Random chills, creaks, and strange noises. They all made sense now. The thought of her watching me, perhaps even contemplating more than theft, sent shivers down my spine. I packed my belongings within minutes, refusing to spend another second in that room. As we drove away, the darkened hotel loomed in the rearview mirror, its shadows stretching like claws across the parking lot. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of the hollow cavity haunted me, and I couldn't shake the question. How many others had she watched from behind the mirror? The unsettling guest. The Midwest Hotel was quiet, nestled in a sleepy town that seemed worlds away from the bustling chaos of cities. I had been working there for a little over a month as a housekeeper, my first real job since graduating high school. The hotel was modest, just 2 floors and about 40 rooms, and most of the guests were traveling workers or families passing through. When I told my parents about the job, they raised their eyebrows. "That place is sketchy," my dad warned. "Be careful." I shrugged it off. The guests seemed polite, if not a bit distant. Nothing about the place felt dangerous. But that was before the man in room 204. It started like any other morning. I clocked in at 10:30 a.m., greeted the front desk manager, and grabbed my cleaning supplies. My first assignment was a set of stayover rooms. Rooms where guests were staying more than one night and only required light tidying. I preferred these because they were faster to clean. I started down the hallway toward the end where the less trafficked rooms were located. The hallway was quiet, except for the faint hum of the vending machine. At the far end of the hall were 4 rooms tucked into a corner, two on each side. As I approached, the door to one of them creaked open. A man stepped out, his hulking figure filling the doorway. He looked to be in his mid-40s, standing well over 6 feet tall, with a broad, heavy build that seemed to dwarf my own petite frame. His gray t-shirt clung to him, damp with sweat, and his jeans were frayed at the cuffs. "Hi there," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Do you know how to work the coffee machine in my room?" His size unnerved me, but I forced a polite smile. "Sure, I can show you." He stepped aside, gesturing for me to enter. I hesitated, suddenly hyper-aware of how isolated this part of the hotel was. My manager was down the hall in another room, and there wasn't another guest in sight. "I'll grab it for you," I offered instead. I retrieved the machine from his room, showed him how to use it in the hallway, and quickly returned it. He thanked me with a lingering gaze that made my skin crawl. I moved on to the next room, hoping he'd retreat to his own and leave me be. But minutes later, as I was changing the linens, I heard his door open again. His heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway, stopping just outside my room. "No need to clean mine," he said. His voice startled me, making me jump. I turned to see him leaning casually against the doorframe, watching me. "Oh," I replied, forcing another smile. "Got it. Thanks for letting me know." He didn't leave. He just stood there, his gaze unrelenting. I kept working, trying to ignore him, but my heart began to race. Finally, he turned and walked away. Relief washed over me. I quickly finished the room and moved to the next one across the hall. As I was stripping the bed, his voice came again, closer this time. "Aren't you scared to do this job?" I froze, my hands clutching the sheets. He was standing in the doorway again, his massive frame blocking most of the light. "No," I said, trying to sound casual. "Not really. I don't interact with guests much." "You should be," he said, his tone sharp and ominous. "A girl like you, all alone. You need mace. A weapon." I laughed nervously, pulling my car keys from my pocket and jingling them. "These work well enough." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Not good enough," he said, taking a step closer. "You're small. Someone could snatch you up easily." My throat tightened. I managed a shaky, "Thanks for the advice," before darting into the bathroom to collect myself. My pulse pounded in my ears. After a few moments, I heard his door close. I peeked out, relieved to see the hallway empty, but the feeling of unease stayed with me. I left the room and went into one further down the hall, locking the door behind me. My hands trembled as I pulled out my phone, considering whether to call my manager. Was I overreacting? He hadn't threatened me outright, had he? But his words repeated in my mind. "You're small. Someone could snatch you up easily." I stayed in that locked room for the next hour, unable to focus on cleaning. My manager eventually found me there, tears streaking my face as I tried to catch my breath. I told her everything. She took my concerns seriously, walking me out of the hallway and finishing my tasks herself. I was allowed to leave early that day, but the man's words stayed with me long after I left. Every time I returned to that hallway, I felt his presence, as though he were still watching from the shadows. It was the kind of night that felt like the world was holding its breath. The air was thick with fog, curling around the streetlights and muffling the usual sounds of the city. I had been out late, staying longer than I should have at a friend's house on the other side of town. By the time I left, the buses had stopped running, and my only option was to walk home. The quickest route took me over the old railway bridge. It wasn't my favorite path, especially at night. The bridge was notorious for its eerie atmosphere, an iron structure that groaned and creaked in the wind, with railings so rusted they seemed ready to crumble at a touch. Below, the train tracks stretched endlessly in both directions, disappearing into the mist. I pulled my jacket tighter against the chill as I started up the incline, my footsteps echoing hollowly against the metal grating. The fog was denser here, swirling around my legs and making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. I kept my head down, focusing on the path in front of me, trying to ignore the way the shadows seemed to shift in the corners of my vision. Halfway across the bridge, I heard it. Footsteps. They weren't mine. They came from somewhere ahead, faint but steady, matching my rhythm. I stopped abruptly, my heart pounding in my chest. The other footsteps stopped too. I squinted into the fog, my breath visible in the cold air. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing against my ears like a weight. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it. Then the footsteps started again, slow and deliberate, drawing closer. I felt a chill run down my spine as a figure emerged from the fog. A man, tall and thin, dressed in a dark coat. His face was partially obscured by the shadow of his hat, but there was something unnerving about the way he moved. His steps too smooth, too purposeful. I forced myself to keep walking, my eyes locked on the figure. As we neared each other, I moved to the side, giving him plenty of space to pass. But he didn't pass. He stopped, just a few feet in front of me, blocking my path. "Lost?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. "No," I said quickly, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just heading home." He tilted his head slightly, as if studying me. His face was still partially hidden, but I could feel his eyes on me, sharp and unblinking. "Home's a dangerous place to be," he said, almost as if he were talking to himself. I stepped back instinctively, my hands clenching into fists at my sides. "Excuse me," I muttered, moving to walk around him. But as I stepped to the side, so did he. The fog seemed to thicken around us, the cold seeping into my bones. "It's late," he said softly, almost kindly. "You shouldn't be out here alone." "I'm fine," I snapped, my fear bubbling into anger. I moved again, more forcefully this time, and he didn't stop me. But as I passed him, I felt his eyes follow me, the weight of his gaze burning into my back. I quickened my pace, my footsteps clanging against the grating as I hurried toward the end of the bridge. The fog seemed heavier now, wrapping around me like a shroud. I glanced back once, half expecting to see the man still standing there, watching me. But the bridge was empty. Relief washed over me as I stepped off the bridge and onto the solid pavement of the street. I turned down a familiar alleyway that cut through the neighborhood, eager to put as much distance as possible between myself and that unsettling encounter. Then I heard it again. Footsteps. My heart sank as I realized they weren't coming from behind me. They were ahead, echoing softly in the narrow alleyway. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. The figure stepped out from the shadows, his dark coat blending into the dim surroundings. It was the man from the bridge. "How?" I stammered, taking a step back. "How did you—" "You shouldn't have crossed," he interrupted, his voice as calm as ever. He took a step toward me, and I stumbled backward, my hands scraping against the rough brick wall. The bridge doesn't like when people cross it at night. "What are you talking about?" I demanded, my voice rising in panic. "What do you want?" He didn't answer. Instead, he raised one hand, pointing back toward the direction I had come. His face was clearer now, illuminated by the faint glow of a nearby streetlight. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were hollow, like dark pits that seemed to draw in the light. "Go back," he said, his voice colder now, more commanding. "Before it's too late." I didn't wait to hear more. I turned and ran, my legs burning as I sprinted down the alley and back onto the main street. I didn't stop until I reached my apartment, slamming the door shut behind me and locking every bolt. My chest heaved as I pressed my back against the door, listening for any sound outside. There was nothing. No footsteps, no voices. Just the distant hum of the city. The next morning, I woke to find a strange mark on my door, a long, jagged scratch that hadn't been there before. It looked like it had been made with something sharp, but there was no sign of anyone having been outside. I've avoided that bridge ever since. Even during the day, I can't bring myself to cross it, and on foggy nights, when the city grows quiet and the air feels heavy, I sometimes think I can hear footsteps in the distance, slow and deliberate, waiting. The knock in the night. It was just past midnight when I heard the first knock. The sound was faint but deliberate, echoing through the thin walls of my small apartment. I sat frozen on the couch, my book forgotten in my lap. The soft hum of the television, which I'd left on for background noise, now felt too loud. I muted it and strained to listen. There it was again. A slow, rhythmic knock at the door. I lived alone on the third floor of a quiet building. My neighbors were an older couple who never stayed up late, and the rest of the apartments on my floor were empty. The landlord had been trying to fill them for months. No one should have been knocking on my door, not at this hour. I rose cautiously, my bare feet silent against the worn carpet as I approached the door. My hand hesitated over the peephole. Something about this felt wrong, like whoever was on the other side knew I'd come closer. When I finally peered through, my stomach dropped. The hallway was empty. I stood there, heart pounding, staring at the dimly lit corridor. The door across from mine was closed, its faded number barely visible in the flickering overhead light. There was no one in sight. I exhaled shakily and backed away from the door, telling myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I'd dozed off and dreamed the sound. I turned the TV volume back on, trying to drown out my growing unease. Then it came again. Knock. 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 This time it was louder, more insistent. My skin prickled as I froze in place, my eyes darting to the door. I grabbed my phone from the coffee table, my thumb hovering over the screen as I debated whether to call someone. The police? A neighbor? Would they even believe me? Gathering my courage, I approached the door again, this time gripping the handle tightly. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling despite my effort to sound firm. Silence. The hallway beyond the door was unnervingly quiet. No footsteps, no rustling, just the faint hum of the overhead light. My fingers tightened on the handle, and for a moment I considered unlocking it, throwing it open just to prove there was no one there. But something stopped me. A feeling, an instinct, like a warning siren blaring in the back of my mind, screaming at me to stay put. I took a step back, my heart racing, and grabbed the nearest object, a heavy lamp from the side table. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. My hands shook as I held it, my eyes fixed on the door. Knock, knock, knock. This time, it didn't come from the front door. It came from the window. I whipped around, the lamp nearly slipping from my grasp. My apartment was on the 3rd floor. There was no fire escape, no ledge wide enough for anyone to stand on. The window faced a quiet alley where nothing but dumpsters and stray cats lingered. The curtains were drawn, and I debated whether or not to pull them back. My pulse thundered in my ears as I crept toward the window, the lamp still clutched in my hand. The knocking continued, steady and deliberate, like a metronome counting down to something inevitable. I reached for the edge of the curtain, hesitating for what felt like an eternity. My breath hitched as I finally yanked it aside. Nothing. The alley below was empty, bathed in the pale glow of the streetlights. The window itself was locked, its surface clear of any smudges or marks. There was no sign of anyone or anything that could have made the noise. And yet, as I stood there, staring out into the night, the knocking began again. This time, it came from behind me. I turned slowly, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run. The sound was coming from inside the apartment now, soft, deliberate taps against the closet door in the bedroom. I stepped backward, my breath catching as the knocking grew louder. The door rattled slightly, as if something on the other side was testing the handle. My legs felt like lead, my grip on the lamp tightening until my knuckles turned white. Then, the knocking stopped. Silence filled the apartment, thick and oppressive. I waited, my chest rising and falling with shallow breaths, every nerve on edge. And then the closet door creaked open. I didn't wait to see what was inside. Dropping the lamp, I bolted for the front door, fumbling with the locks before yanking it open and running into the hallway. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cold night air stinging my skin as I gasped for breath. I spent the rest of the night at a nearby diner, surrounded by the comforting hum of other people and the bright fluorescent lights. When I finally returned to my apartment the next morning, the door was still locked, the windows untouched. Everything was exactly as I had left it, except for the closet door. It was wide open, and on the inside of the door, scratched deep into the wood, were the words, "I told you to open it." The farmhouse lights. It started when I moved into my grandparents' old farmhouse. They had passed away a few years prior, and my parents had no interest in maintaining the property. It was isolated, sitting on a few acres of overgrown fields, surrounded by dense woods. The nearest neighbor was over a mile away, and the only road leading to the house was more pothole than pavement. I wasn't thrilled about living there alone, but I had just graduated college and needed a place to stay while I figured out my next steps. The house was old and creaky, with peeling wallpaper and a persistent smell of damp earth. But it was home, for now. The first night, I noticed the lights. I had just finished unpacking and was sitting in the living room, scrolling through my phone. Outside, the wind whistled through the trees, and the occasional hoot of an owl broke the silence. The house was surrounded by darkness, with no streetlights for miles. I hadn't even bothered to hang curtains yet, figuring no one would be looking in. Then I saw it. A faint glow coming from the edge of the woods. At first, I thought it was a flashlight. Maybe someone had wandered onto the property, lost or curious. I stood and peered out the window, squinting into the darkness. The light swayed gently, like it was being carried by someone walking. "Hello?" I called out, though my voice was muffled by the glass. The light didn't stop. It moved slowly along the tree line, almost rhythmic, before disappearing into the woods. I locked the door and told myself it was probably a hunter or a kid messing around. This was the countryside, after all. People wandered. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that settled in my chest. The next night the light returned. This time, it was closer. I watched from the kitchen window as it appeared near the old barn, glowing faintly in the darkness. It wasn't the harsh beam of a flashlight. It was softer, almost golden, like the light from a lantern. It flickered slightly, casting long shadows across the overgrown grass. I stepped outside onto the porch, the wooden boards creaking under my weight. "Hey!" I shouted, louder this time. "Who's there?" The light paused. For a moment I thought whoever it was might answer. But then it began to move again, drifting toward the woods until it disappeared. I told myself not to panic. Maybe it was just a neighbor checking on the property, though I hadn't seen anyone in the 2 days I'd been there. Still, I locked every door and window before going to bed, my nerves on edge. By the third night, the light wasn't just outside. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the faint sound of footsteps. My bedroom was on the second floor, overlooking the fields. Groggy and disoriented, I sat up, listening intently. The footsteps were soft but deliberate, like someone walking across the creaky floorboards of the living room. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The sound stopped. I climbed out of bed and grabbed the heavy flashlight I kept on the nightstand. My heart pounded as I opened the bedroom door, the hallway stretching out before me in darkness. The farmhouse had no central lighting, just old lamps scattered throughout, most of which didn't work. I stepped into the hall, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the shadows. The living room was empty. The front door was locked, just as I had left it. I checked the windows, also locked. The only sound was the faint hum of the fridge from the kitchen. Then I saw it, the light. It was inside, glowing faintly in the doorway to the kitchen. My breath caught in my throat as I watched it flicker, casting shifting shadows on the walls. It swayed gently, like it was being carried, though there was no one there. I stepped back, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The light began to move, drifting toward me. My legs felt like they were rooted to the floor, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't. I was frozen, watching as it came closer. It stopped just a few feet away. For a moment, the room was silent, save for the pounding of my heart. Then the light blinked out, leaving me in darkness. I don't remember how I made it back to my bedroom, but I must have, because I woke up the next morning curled under the blankets, the flashlight still clutched in my hand. The house was silent, the morning sun streaming through the windows. I convinced myself it had been a dream, a trick of exhaustion and stress. But when I went downstairs, I found the front door unlocked, the heavy latch dangling open. The lights continued every night after that. Sometimes they were outside, drifting through the fields or swaying near the barn. Other times, I'd wake to find them inside, glowing faintly in the corners of the rooms, just out of reach. They never made a sound, never approached me again. But their presence was constant, an unspoken reminder that I was never truly alone in that house. I stayed for 3 weeks before I couldn't take it anymore. I packed my things and left, moving into a cramped apartment in the city. The farmhouse still sits empty, its windows dark and lifeless. Sometimes when I visit my parents, I drive past it at night, and sometimes I see the lights